lost contact.
Buyurun.
Dear participants, hi, this is Professor Dr. Tuğba Karabulut, and today we are having 31st Science and Society meeting, and we are hosting Professor Dr. Michael Hitt. He is very well-known strategic management professor, and we are very happy to host him in our university's 31st Science and Society meeting. So I would like to also thank to our rector, vice rector, dean to give me this chance. And today we'll be talking about strategy, resource orchestration, and innovation in a non-ergodic world. So Professor Hitt will give us a nice presentation, will make a nice presentation to us. Welcome, dear Professor, to our university's webinar.
My pleasure, and a pleasure to be here with you today. Obviously, you've noted the title of my talk, and I'll try to explain first what we mean by non-ergodic. It's a rather unique term.
But dear Professor, first of all, our vice rector would like to say welcome to you as well. So,
okay, I'm sorry.
So would you like to say welcome to our
I apologize.
Professor Hitt? And yeah, you can make your presentation later on.
Thank you very much. I will keep short because in all words we will hear from Professor Hitt's mouth is so valuable for us. As Professor Karabulut told us, welcome to our 31st webinar, Science and Society meeting. It's a pleasure for us to being with Professor Hitt today. If I say some words about him, he's a well-known professor. Our guest today is distinguished Professor Michael Hitt. He's, as we know, as our students also know, he's the co-writer of Strategic Management, Competitiveness, and Globalization book, one of the most important in this field. Also, he's co-authored, if I'm not wrong, he's co-authored and co-edited 26 books, and also he's an academician whose academic publications have received more than 120,000 citations. So it's a pleasure for us, as I said before, and also Professor Karabulut also give the title of his speech today. So it's going to be a great pleasure for us to listen this topic from him today. As I said before, I will keep short for saving time. We are very happy to be with him because he is our guest today, and I want to thank him for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Professor Hitt.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the very kind words and for the welcome. Shall I start? Make sure I'm okay. Well, it's a very definitive pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to talk about strategy, entrepreneurship, innovation, and resources in this non-ergodic world. And I'm going to begin by talking about this term ergodic, so you at least understand it. Obviously, it's an English term, but the term ergodic is based in mathematical logic. And the essential suggestion comes from a notion of systems theory and understanding of systems, that there are changes that occur in systems, but assumedly, after some sustained period of change, there's a return to the conditions that were at least similar to or very the same as the state as it was originally. And the point is that we don't live in that kind of world now. It's a non-ergodic. Partly because the competitive landscape has been very dynamic, especially over the last 20 years. I mean, it really has been for a long period of time, but especially in the last 20 years, we've seen many technology developments, socio-political developments, et cetera, that have changed that landscape. I refer to, and where I actually was introduced to this term non-ergodic was through the work of Douglas North, who's an institutional economist, and he's also a Nobel laureate. He suggested that we live and operate in a non-ergodic world in which after change, we do achieve some equilibrium, state of equilibrium, but that change is dynamic. And that does what first does not return to the state it was originally, and it's dynamic. In other words, it's really temporary. It's like what in systems theory we call dynamic equilibrium. The equilibrium point keeps changing over time. And so we have to be prepared as we operate, and I'm thinking about businesses, to operate in that kind of environment. And it's actually very critical. And we can see this in most recently the pandemic that we've all experienced through the world, and the changes that have occurred because of that in terms of our business world, and it won't change. It's into a new normal, as we call it, but even that new normal state changes over time. So our current non-ergodic world is really characterized by multiple changes, obviously technology, political, socio-political, and institutional changes. Institutional at the country level, but even down through our organization, our societies, and frankly across, because there are many regional organizations like in Europe, European Union, in North America, and in Asia. There are multiple treaties and relationships among countries across those country borders, and businesses that operate must deal with those, either to enter those markets and or access, say, suppliers and so forth from those markets. So as those changes occur, they must adapt or find a way to deal with those changes. Now, quite obviously, since 2000, which is just a little over 2 decades or 20 years, we've experienced a number of disruptive, highly disruptive events. Some of these are, well, their world, 9/11, it happened in the US, but it also affected much of the rest of the world. 2008 financial crisis, it actually began in the US, but then emanated out into Europe and Asia and so forth across the globe, and affected, again, most markets, financial markets, and businesses and the way they operated over time. And most recently, I noted earlier, and I think we noted in earlier comments, that COVID, the pandemic, has really had a major effect. We're just now emerging to some degree from that pandemic and the effects thereof. The changes that occurred during that time will go forward. I've written a couple of articles on this within the last year that talk about what we expect in terms of the future that comes out of this pandemic and all the other changes that impacted within countries and across countries. I use a site. I don't fully agree with this citation, this quote, but I do think it's dramatic. It's from a book published by Fareed Zakaria, published in 2020, late 2020, and he talked about many things, but he was really focused on the, again, pandemic. He said there are decades when nothing happens. That's where I actually disagree. But there are weeks when decades happen. He's really talking about where major disruptive events occur. And as the worst passes, we emerge into what he referred to as the dead cold of tomorrow. What that really means, in my interpretation, is that it's a changed environment, a changed operational environment for businesses, and it won't go back to the normal that we saw before that time. So we have this non-ergodic world. Now, firms have got to compete in this non-ergodic world. And what do? To do that means they have to have new and more flexible strategies to try to navigate in the competitive dynamics in this, what's some have referred to as the new normal environment, which is a continuously changing new normal environment. What we'll see, and I'll argue, and we'll talk about some of these points today, that firms must be strategic, they must be entrepreneurial, and out of that, they must be innovative in order to achieve a competitive advantage and to sustain it. Now, I'm going to come back to this at the end and talk about a term that we use called strategic entrepreneurship and what that really means. And really, it's fairly simple, but it's not simple in operation. So firms now, to step back, if to have the strategies they need, they have to have the appropriate resources to design and particularly to implement, not to design necessarily, but to implement unique strategies. So part of the notion of being flexible and having new strategies is that they have to have the resource base and capabilities that allow them to design and implement these new or unique strategies. And one way we have internal development of resources, and that occurs hopefully in most firms. I'll use an example because one of the most important internal resources is, well, I'm going to use the economic term or strategy term and say human capital, but the human resource. And firms develop those human resources and the human capital, and that's an important part of developing and maintaining their a high quality resource portfolio. But many times they have to access resources externally as well. And so another important element of this is building and maintaining strong positive relationships with critical stakeholders. Now, Jay Barney, who I think we just talked about before we started this, who's very well known for the resource-based U. In most recent times, his writing is focused on the importance of stakeholders and building relationships with stakeholders. He has a chapter with Mackey in one of our most recent books, which is an edited book on the current state and the future of the field of strategic management. And he talks about the importance of stakeholders in kind of this new future that firms must operate in. Now, the types of strategies, there are all kinds of strategic notions that can be used. I'm going to use a couple of terms that fit this notion of a changing environment and refer to terms that were developed by Rendova and Courtney, and then also enriched and enhanced by Kathy Eisenhardt. And they're talking about adaptive and shaping strategies. Now, essentially what you have to assume that if firms have to be flexible, they have to change over time. And what Rendova and Courtney suggest that they have adaptive strategies, adapting to the changes in the environment, or shaping strategies, which in a sense lead or kind of identify their own environments and changes. Adaptive strategies help firms to identify what are the critical attributes of these uncertain markets, and then design ways to respond to them. And I'll talk about that in a bit as I talk about these notions. Shaping strategies, and Kathy Eisenhardt's done a lot of recent work and some interesting, again, a chapter in our book that I mentioned earlier on the current state and future of the field of strategic management, talks about shaping strategies and the importance of them. Essentially, shaping strategies are intended to identify opportunities created by the uncertain environment, and then to take steps and take actions to exploit those opportunities. In many ways, these are firms that are kind of leading in that environment. And they, by designing and they're being more innovative. She's talking about entrepreneurial, but those two go together. They are being innovative and developing new products and services, and maybe even new business models and ways of competing. Shaping then over time may be also the highest one with the highest risk and is the most challenging. And I would argue that, and we found, much of the research has found over the last, say, 20 years and longer, that many firms, particularly those what you call established firms, have been in operation for a while, will tend to employ adaptive strategies, and even there, it'll be incremental adaptive strategies that may help them in the short term, but will actually be to their disadvantage over the long term. So firms must be, I believe, if they want to really not only achieve a competitive advantage, but to sustain it, they have to engage in shaping strategies, and they have to be entrepreneurial and innovative. And yet, those are the most challenging and the most risky to utilize. To do these, to engage in either one of these strategies or both. And many firms actually will engage in both. It's generally not always one or the other, but it could be both of them. They're going to have valuable resources that allow them to develop the capabilities they need to adapt or to be innovative and move into new markets or to existing markets with new products. So they must build a strong and maintain a strong resource portfolio. Several years ago, David Sermon, myself, and Dwayne Ireland developed an article. It was published in the Academy Management Review. At the time, we called it the management of resources, and it was intended to be an extension of the resource-based view. And how it's an extension of it is it discusses the importance of building this resource portfolio and how you manage those resources to create and develop the capabilities needed to implement the strategies that you intend to employ. And going forward, we've now more recently referred to this as resource orchestration, or the orchestration or management of those resources. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, resources can be acquired from external sources, or they can be developed internally. The intent is that managing this resource portfolio is a continuous process, not a, we develop it and we do this and then we develop capabilities, then we implement strategies. It's a continuous process and of development and upgrading of the resources. And that's critical in this kind of environment. So they have to, what I would argue is that most firms have to do both. They have to develop internally the resources they can develop, and they have to acquire resources from external sources. The key issue is that they have to build valuable capabilities that allow them to engage in the strategies they need and to stay ahead of their competition. In a recent study that I did with several others, one of the things we found is that in these dynamic environments, firms would employ entrepreneurial strategies, but basically when they had strong relationships with their stakeholders. And we argued that that's largely because they had better access to those external resources, and in doing so, it reduced their risk in these uncertain environments. So let me take it a step further, because I talked about these resource portfolios that firms have to continuously develop. The intent or the idea is that they are developing capabilities to do something, capabilities to offer certain types of products, or to develop new products, or to compete in certain markets. Now, in a study that David Brock and I have done very recent times, in fact, we presented the paper at the most recent Academy of Management meetings in August, just last month. We did a review of articles, research that had been done on capabilities in international, multinational firms. And then based on this, what we tried to identify were capabilities that were of value and most value for firms to be successful. Now, I'm only going to talk, we identified 4 different types as noted on my slide, but I'm going to talk about 2 of those, strategic dynamic capabilities and meta capabilities. All the capabilities types of capabilities we identified are important. These I consider to be the most critical types of capabilities for firms in this changing environment, the non-ergodic environment. Dynamic capabilities, actually, obviously that comes from the work of David Teese and colleagues. We were introduced to this in an article that he published with 2 others in 1997 in the Strategic Management Journal, the notion of dynamic capabilities. He's further enhanced this through several other works, along with others that have been involved in this as well, and where he's talked about essentially what they are, second order capabilities. Now, dynamic capability is the capability to develop new capabilities or to enrich current capabilities. And he talks about in a more recent piece in 2009 and then past that, the intent is of sensing, sensing what this environment is, seizing opportunities, and he uses the term shaping, which is what we've just talked about earlier, and that Eisenhardt and others build on, of shaping the new strategy and the operations of the firm toward these new markets. In other words, changing the capabilities and shaping the new capabilities that will help you compete and hopefully lead the new environment. Alternatively, meta capabilities, and this is something I have to admit I've read a lot on dynamic capabilities since Ties's original work and reading a lot by Ties, but others like Connie Helfat and some of her work on dynamic capabilities. Meta capabilities was actually proposed, I believe, the first time by David Collis in 1994. That's the first time well, it was the original site that I've been able to find on meta capabilities. These are what's called third order capabilities, and meta capability is the capability to develop dynamic capabilities, which in turn is to ability to develop new capabilities and or enrich the current ones. In other words, you have to do this to do it, and saying, so really firms in this current environment have to have both meta capabilities to develop and maintain dynamic capabilities and dynamic capabilities that help them to say innovate better, faster, and to meet the challenges in the current strategic environment. Now, I have to admit, for a long time, I had problems trying to understand dynamic capabilities. The interesting thing is Ties did not overlap this with the resource-based view, which was also a very important element. And from my standpoint, the two really fit together. But you're talking about capabilities, and in effect, the resource-based view, even though the original versions of it really focus on, in quotes, resources, if you read most of Jay's early work, he kind of uses the terms resources and capabilities interchangeably. In our 2007 work in the Academy of Management Review, the theory piece on what we termed then resource management and have since referred to as resource orchestration, we really talk about how you develop these new capabilities. So in a sense, we're talking about dynamic capabilities. Interestingly, when we were in the process of that article, and when I say process, not developing it, but well, it was in the original development of it, we mentioned the idea of dynamic capabilities. In the review process, eventually the reviewers and the editor recommended we drop that term because it was becoming so complex in the process. So we did, but it's still a part of managing resources, dynamic capabilities. And essentially what you're doing with whether you talk about the resource-based view, et cetera, you're building capabilities in the firm to engage in the strategies you need to engage in to operate effectively in the market. Now, we're saying at the conclusions, but I want to spend a little time on this because I want to explain here what we mean, and then I want to give an example at least to hopefully help you a little bit understand what we're trying to note. Just a second, let me get my batteries running low. I got to plug it in. Okay. Essentially, we've been talking about building capabilities, and if you look at history over time, if we just look at over time in the study of firms, it shows that being creative and using your ingenuity, born of entrepreneurship, it is really important in challenging times. And what you're doing is contributing to positive market opportunities and stronger competitive advantage. And that builds from Zakaria's book. But I'm going to go back. The first article I published, I believe it was in long time ago, 1973, 1974, was talking about the creative organization. And I've stayed with that idea along with a lot of other work that I've done over time. Still believe that it's that creative organization that's entrepreneurial that is the one that's going to be most successful. Back in late 1990s and or early 2000s, Dwayne Ireland and I developed this notion of strategic entrepreneurship. Now, what we mean by that is that firms have to be both strategic and entrepreneurial simultaneously in order to not only maintain where they are, but to succeed over time. Now, I'm going to use a couple of just broad generalizations. Most large firms, this isn't true of every firm, but many large firms that are established, been around over time, and have continued to operate, continued to stay in the market. They do so because they've been strategic. They've been able to identify their markets. They've been able to understand their customers and understand their competitors, and somehow navigate in that process to satisfy customers, to avoid or to at least do as well as or better than their competitors in this environment. But they're not necessarily entrepreneurial. In fact, a lot of research has shown that these established firms that have been successful over time are reluctant to engage in entrepreneurial actions. Now, that doesn't mean they won't make incremental changes and changes to their product line, et cetera, but to develop a whole new product line and bring it into existence. Some firms do, but if you look at most have not over time. Alternatively, I've studied entrepreneurial firms as well. And entrepreneurial firms, by definition, generally are entrepreneurial. That's why they come into existence, and they serve oftentimes a new need in the marketplace. Either they have developed a new product, a new service, or they take an existing product and service their customers much more effectively, or service customers in the market much better than the existing competitors. So they're entrepreneurial. But if they're not also strategic, they will not remain in the market. They won't be able to stay there. Now, let me use an example. This came to me just a few days ago. About a year ago, I discovered a new product that I hadn't seen before. It was a small generator, if you will, but it generates air to air up tires and other things where air is needed. And I especially was interested in it for automobile tires that may become low, et cetera. We have a generator. You can go to places where you can get them aired up, but you have to get there. If they're flat, you have to change the tire. But I purchased this. It's a handheld little device that I can air up a tire, and I can recharge it. Simply plug it in. There's a device to plug it in and recharge it. So I purchased this and did it and I've used it a couple of times in the last year. I decided, because I have two automobiles, that I would like to have another one to carry in my other automobile. So I went online to purchase a new product, one of these, again, the same product. What I discovered is there is another product on the market that's essentially the same, and it's offered with actually better features and at a lower price. Now, this makes a point. I actually have now purchased that product. Now you say, well, okay, but what does that mean for what he's talking about here? Well, essentially, if an entrepreneurial firm brings a new product to the market that's successful in the market, that means there's a market out there, their customers desire it, that it will be that attracts other firms to enter that market. or others to enter that market, and they will find a way to imitate what you do and or to do it better in terms of offering better product attributes or at different price points. And so that's what exactly has happened to this firm. It was an entrepreneurial firm that developed this product, very unique. I can hold it in my hand easily, attach it to a tire, say, and air it up, which I couldn't do before. And now there's another product on the market that's come out sometime within the last year that does the same thing. That happens in all markets. So what this means is even entrepreneurial firms must be strategic. Now what that means is they have to be aware of their environment, of their competitors, of their future or potential competitors, and take actions to stay ahead of them. So existing firms, which tend not to be highly entrepreneurial if they've been successful, because they don't want to take the risk. They continue to do what they did before because that was successful. But in this changing environment, they can't continue to do that. They have to change with it. And so they have to be entrepreneurial. So whether they're large or small, new or long-term businesses, they have to be both strategic and entrepreneurial. And that's essentially what we argue right now, what we've argued for the last 20 years. And we had a special issue that Dwayne and I co-edited for the Strategic Management Journal in 2001 on this notion of strategic entrepreneurship, and we've continued on. Of course, there's a journal that I helped found called Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. And again, the notion is firms have to be both strategic and entrepreneurial. So when we look at this, we have to be in that way. Now let's take a step back. Say, well, what about existing firms? How do they change their resource portfolio to be using these capabilities I mentioned earlier, say dynamic capabilities or meta capabilities? Well, I'll give you one way. This is just what I'll call an anecdote or a case example, but it at least gives you some feel for what can happen. It's not the only way that you can change. But I'm doing a study right now. I'm engaged in a study. Actually, I have the data, and we have a paper that's just developed on mergers and acquisitions. And now these are all U.S. firms, but they're studied over time. So we have thousands of observations of acquisitions over a span of a number of years. And we have data on them and on their capabilities, the capabilities of the acquiring firm that made the acquisition, and of the target that ended up being acquired and then merged into the firm. So as I studied that, simultaneously, I was conducting this study on capabilities that I mentioned to you earlier. And I began, we started studying some of these firms. I actually did some research on the firms that were in our sample to understand why some of them were so highly successful when others were not. And one of the reasons that firms were highly successful is they were able to use the strategy of acquiring another firm to acquire new capabilities that added into their current and somehow complemented their current capabilities and enhanced their base. Now, I use one example. I'm not going to go into a lot of these because they're just low. We got thousands of companies. I didn't go into each example, each company to understand this, although we did look at 40 different companies. Symantec, which was a very successful firm that had antiviral software and sold that in the US, and it was a market leader in this field. But there, as I noted earlier, when you've got something that's successful and others see something that's successful in the market, they're going to enter that market with a competitive product, and others did. So Symantec saying we needed to change because in order to stay ahead of our competition, we needed to change. And over a period of about 2 years, they made 3 different acquisitions. And those 3 different acquisitions, each time added capabilities, new capabilities. Now they were what I would call complementary, but also allowed them to expand the product base that they had. So they moved from being a firm that basically sold antivirus software to individuals and to companies to being a corporate security and software company. So they really essentially developed programs and help companies to secure their information technology operations and avoid being phished and in other ways to create problems for them, right? So they were not just antivirus, but they were a way of developing security for these companies in the information technology environment. Much broader, and they have become highly successful. We studied our dependent variable in this study was Tobin's Q. It means one way of establishing value creation. And this firm, Symantec, based on its acquisitions, had extremely high Tobin's Q. It created value with these new acquisitions over time. There's a lot of acquisitions don't produce that value, but they did. So they used this acquisition to what we call dynamic capabilities and being able to change and enrich. They added new capabilities, and then they were able to integrate those capabilities with the others and develop a kind of a broader identity and a broader market that they serve. So in a sense, what we're talking about is firms have to be entrepreneurial, they have to be innovative, they have to change over time, and it has to be a continuous process. They're continuously managing, if they're successful, their resource portfolio. They're very conscious of the capabilities that they now have and trying to acquire resources that help them enrich or update those capabilities, but also to develop new ones or to add new ones from external sources. And that is kind of this new landscape that all firms, frankly, that I know almost in any environment that operate, even within domestic borders, if there are multinational or international competitors that operate there as well. So essentially, nearly all firms have to do this. And again, whether it's large or small, new or well-established. So with that, I'll stop to see if there are questions and if you have any directions you would like to go. I'll turn the floor back.
Okay, thank you very much, dear Professor. I would like to remind to the audience that you are one of the most cited author in management over 25 years. So it's a great success. Thank you very much. It was a very nice presentation. I would like to ask, which resource is the most important, do you think, for the companies? Maybe it can change depending upon their sectors.
Well, that's a very good question and important question, actually. I will say I'm gonna be somewhat general, but also then become more specific. When we look at now, my accounting colleagues talk about tangible and intangible resources. Tangible resources obviously are those that are physical, like land and manufacturing plants and whatever, buildings and facilities and so forth. They are very important, but we've learned over time that the intangible capabilities are the ones that actually create the greatest value for firms over time. And we say intangible, because in some ways they are tangible, but they're not. I mean, I'll use, since we're talking about innovation, I'll start with saying that patents, trademarks, and even brands, which are my marketing colleagues focus on, are intangible resources that are quite important to most firms. But beyond that, if you want to look at it, what I consider the most critical of the intangible resources, it's something I mentioned in the talk, and that is human resources are the human capital. Because I believe that human capital essentially drives all of this. In other words, we don't develop patents unless we have the research that underlies that, and that is done by engineers, research scientists, or others that do that. The brands are based on products and the marketing and the promotion, et cetera, and we develop brand equity, as my marketing colleagues say. But that still is driven by the human capital that operates in those areas. And then the intellectual capabilities that exist there, and then their own use and application of those capabilities for the purpose of the firm. And I believe that's global. Wherever we are, whatever the firms are, where they exist, it's the human capital. So that is the most important intangible resource, even though the other intangible resources are also critical. I don't know that this is how accurate this is, because I haven't done this research per se, but I've read some work that argues that between 70 and 80% of the value of a firm is defined by intangible resources. Now, within that, I don't know that we can distribute it equally and say, well, it's done by 10% patents and so on, but because it would vary based on the type of industry and the type of firm and so on. But I would say that somewhere more than 70% of the value of the firm is normally what is normally created by the intangible assets. So that's my answer to you.
Okay, thank you. And how can companies, entrepreneurial companies, create value with limited resources?
All right, that again is a very, because that's nearly every small or new venture firm has limited resources. Actually, nearly all companies have limited resources, but the newer firms will have more limited resources. My best answer that I can give to that is obviously utilize their talent. And normally that's where you've got the intellectual talent involved in developing new products or new services or new ideas, but they have to be focused. So they have difficulty entering a marketplace and competing with these large established firms that have many more resources. So they have to either focus on a market niche, or they have to have such a new, unique product that they're going to draw customers because of the uniqueness of it. And I won't say there are too many that can do that. Then as they'll draw, if they can get the word of mouth and so on, and find ways to do it. Now we do have less expensive ways of promoting our products through our social media and ways that, I'm not saying they're inexpensive, I'm saying they're less expensive than some of the ways we had prior to. So there are ways to do that, but still it's probably better early that they focus their efforts and their focus in the market is in a market niche. And that way they can use the resources to capture whatever the competitive advantage in that niche. And then as they build their resource base, expand it out. Now that's just a general comment. There are examples where firms have been able to come into the market with a great idea and actually capture it even with existing firms that have huge resource bases that are, but tend to be inflexible and not willing to change. Amazon.com, if you go back many years, would be an example of that. A new idea that was brought to the market, it brought to the market competing against very established firms that had a lot of resources, and it did not have, but it took advantage of the internet, which is relatively new at that time, back in the mid-1990s. And these other firms were not willing to change until it was too late. And many of those firms were driven out of the market or made much less important in the marketplace by that firm. Of course, now it's huge. And there are many competitors, many in different regions of the world.
Okay, thank you. Osman Hocam, do you have any questions? He is an associate professor in the field of HR and organizational behavior at our university.
Professor Hitt'i, thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Studying in HR, you said something HR, but I will ask again, what's the role of the HR in this new world, or how its responsibility will be changed in this world?
All right. I actually think that human resources is a really critical function in businesses. And of course, the human resource itself is most critical, but even the human resource function is. You don't know this, but a number of years ago, after I received my master's degree, I entered the business world and corporate world, and I actually worked in what they called at the time corporate human resources. And so that background itself, notion. Now I got involved in a lot of other things. I got assigned projects across functional boundaries, which were very interesting and helped me become more strategic in my orientation. But corporate human resources has been critical, is still critical function in organizations. And if organizations use it correctly, they will be much more successful, because the development of human capital, and again, I'm using that's a term from economics, but we tend to use that now in strategy. The human capital is most critical, and the human resource function within companies can play and should play a very important role in helping to identify and develop and enrich the human capital firm. There's a term that's used, and it's used in strategy now. It's called strategic human resources, and it integrates the human resources and the strategy or strategic notions. In Strategic Management Society, which I am also a part of, and I was president of one time, has an area. We don't call it division, but they're groups. And one group is on strategic human resources, and a number of I'll call it HR scholars have now kind of gravitated into this area, doing research and linking or integrating human resources with firm strategy. So the answer is that it's a very important function, and the human resources are most critical. And actually, in my opinion, if firms don't have strong human capital or human resources, they won't be able to take all these other actions that we talked about. I did a study a number of years ago. It was published in AMJ in the early 2000s, and it was looking at human capital and the role human capital played in strategies. And one of the things that we found, is what I expected, is that the human capital was a critical element of the ability to develop and implement effective strategies. And so, to answer your question, the human resources and human capital are very critical, and the human resource function plays a key role in the development of the human capital and human resources of the firm.
Okay, thank you.
Hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Hocam. Recep Ali Hocam, would you like to ask a question?
Okay.
He's a finance professor. He's an associate professor in the field of management, in the finance. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, dear professor. I have a question, two questions. Dear professor, and these are non-ergodic world.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think about a definition of smart companies and this non-ergodic world and strategic management relationship? As you know, the Alibaba and etc. many firms believes that these are companies, smart companies, and this is there are very important problems in their leadership and software management, data management, velocity, and in the future, in the 10 years, what are the main change trends will be? What do you think about that? And the second question, the old economy companies, how can they suit for this non-ergodic world?
Okay, let me start with the first one, but it ties to your second question. My answer will tie to the second question. What I assume you're talking about when you say smart companies is technology, and you applied that. But it's what I interpret it as is the use of artificial intelligence that's developed within companies and being used and applied. It actually is being used and applied in a whole variety of industries. In some ways, right now, the use of it has been relatively minor. Now, I want to say that it is important, but they haven't used it to its full potential. But it has been applied. The expectation is that it will become much more critical in future times. Now, I don't know that it will. but we see the application of artificial intelligence in a whole variety of ways within companies. We've had in manufacturing what we call robotic technology for some time, which replaces the human element in part of the manufacturing process. I noted very recently, now I don't really know what this means yet. In fact, I just earlier this week read where Tesla is going to, over the next few years, employ human robotics. When they're talking about is in a sense, not just the robotics that we see in the robotic technologies that have been used in manufacturing, but actually humanoid type artificial intelligence that will be used in the manufacture of those automobiles. I don't know exactly what that will be or how it'll be used, but in point of fact, that would be a change to how they've been used in manufacturing in the past. What I would say is I don't know that I have the perfect answer here because I haven't done research on artificial intelligence, but I haven't done a lot of reading at it. And again, what I'm going to refer you to is we have a chapter in our book that I've mentioned a couple of times during my talk on the strategic management, the state of the field, and its future. We have a chapter on the use of artificial intelligence, and part of each of those chapters, this is an edited book, so we have authorities, if you will, where they're focused in their area of expertise. And we asked them not only to talk about the state of the field as it exists today, but to spend at least 40% of their time in the chapters telling us what is going to come in the future. And you might want to, if you can gain access, I'm not trying to sell the book, but maybe through your library system, et cetera, can gain access to that book. There are two chapters, one there by George von Crow and others, and then Fanish Piranam, who was lead in that section, talked about, well, had discussions of artificial intelligence and what they saw in the future. And that may be of help to you. Now, let me change to the second part. Now, my answer is not complete in this, even to the first one, because I don't have enough knowledge of artificial intelligence. I can actually talk about it a little bit more, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in the second question. What can older companies do? Well, what I'm going to say about older established companies that honestly, I believe they're going to have to make major changes. And I don't care where they exist, whether it's in the US or in other parts of the world. They're going to make major changes in the next 10 years, partly because of the technology and the artificial intelligence, maybe other technologies and other actions as well, because we've got a lot of other things that play into this, sociopolitical changes, et cetera. But the technology will drive a lot of changes in businesses. And if they don't adapt to that, if they don't somehow adopt new technologies, my fear is they'll go out of business. And that's certainly happened in the US. And I can give you a number of companies that essentially at one time were either leaders in the field or played prominent roles at 20 years ago that either play a very minor role in the markets today or frankly no longer exist. And it's because their inability to change or adopt the new technologies. Now, let me go back to artificial intelligence just a little bit. Back in the 1980s, there was a notion of developing artificial intelligence. And I know I remember I got into this only because I was on a dissertation committee of a PhD student who was trying to understand, study artificial intelligence at that time and its effect on strategy and on organizations. And what I discovered in doing, not only reading that person's work, but work that helped me operate as an effective, hopefully, committee member, is that the artificial intelligence at that time was really at the early stages. It hadn't developed well at all, hadn't developed much, but the hope was it's going to develop significantly, and it has, but it's been a lot slower than expected. I mean, the intent, they were talking about 10 years, and now what we have now is what they expected in 10 years, and it's we're in the 2020s. So it's 30 years later, 35 years later. I'm not telling you that it's going to be that slow as we go on. I actually think it's going to move much more quickly. We see it in a whole variety of different ways in all kinds of industries, all kinds of industries, service industries, manufacturing. We see it in use in different industries. We see it obviously in military, but we see it also in a lot of other businesses today. When I go to many places, I don't have contact with individuals. I have contact with the technology in terms of when I order things, et cetera, and do things even at their place of business. I don't interact much with humans. I interact with the artificial intelligence that they've inserted into that process. And it does save time. It's more efficient. It's difficult sometimes for people to navigate, but we all have to change. And that's happened. So what I would say to you is those older businesses are going to have to change. Are they over time? How long they'll be able to stay in existence, it'll depend on their competition, their industry, et cetera. But there's just no doubt they will not exist. Many older established firms that don't change won't be around in the next 10 years, in my opinion. And I don't care where we're talking about it. I'm talking about the US, I know best, but also in other parts of the world.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Yes,
very
sir.
much, Professor.
Thank
See
you very much. Esra, would you like to ask a question? She is actually working in Microsoft Turkey, and she also has some background about artificial intelligence as well.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thank you for joining and very valuable presentation. Thanks a lot. Just a quick question. Do you think new way on gaining competitive advantage could be emerged due to pandemic? Because, especially during pandemic and after pandemic, mostly instead of unique products, mostly customized services products, we are recurring. So I think, what do you think about that?
Well, again, I don't know that I'm the perfect person to answer in terms of my knowledge in this area. What I would say is that the changes that are going on are coming very fast. I find a lot of even existing businesses have trouble adapting with the new technologies that are being introduced into the marketplace. And, the adaptation occurs on several sides. And it has to occur, and when we look at this, it occurs obviously within the firm. They have to develop their technology and that impacts the economy. The customers have to adapt. I mentioned earlier now, many times when I go to businesses and try to either purchase products or obtain help, even with services, I interact more with the artificial intelligence that's been inserted in that, the suppliers. The other issue is that this is an international society, and most firms, even young firms, operate internationally, not just in selling their goods internationally, but in obtaining supply chains. Most recently because of the pandemic, and I don't know exactly how it's experienced in Turkey, but I suspect there are at least some similarities. We've had problems with supply chains in the US, partly because they were global. Supply chains became much more international. So the suppliers and the suppliers that firms accessed were international. Now, I'm coming back to the technology in just a minute, but the access to those was a problem with the pandemic, and then the ability to access the operations, et cetera, but also to interface the technologies, to interface on common technologies and to interact are very critical. So all of the firms have to have some commonality or common base of technology in order to interact. Now, how does that impact? Interestingly, most economic issues or policies are established at the domestic level in the US. I'll use the US right now. The US has had a very good economy coming out of the pandemic. Part of it is because of the government injecting a lot of financial resources to help maintain the economy, but it also has done something else. It's increased inflation dramatically within the U.S., much higher than it was. So now they're trying to put the brakes on. Now that is the actions that they're taking are domestic. They affect the U.S. economy. And of course, they affect other economies to the extent that there's interaction, but they're designed to focus and affect the U.S. economy. But all of these things interact because we really have global economies, and so the global technologies are critical. I don't know that I'm answering your question, but all these things interact and are connected, and so it's a much more complex world. I did a special issue. I was a co-editor of a special issue published in the Journal of Management Studies just a couple of years ago. And it was actually looking at this kind of new normal environment. And it was published just before the pandemic kind of hit. But we talked about the technological, socio-political, and institutional changes that were occurring throughout the world, both within domestically, internationally, regionally, and regional organizations, economic, and talking about the complexities that occurred without the pandemic and any of the other disruptions. And all those interact with one another, and it's extremely complex. I'm thinking about not only for us as academics to understand and study and teach, but also for business managers, executives to operate in this environment, and they have to somehow do that. Again, I don't know that I've appropriately answered your question, but we're really dealing with a very, very complex animal. I'm probably not cognitively complex enough to fully appreciate and understand it, but it is a very complex animal that we have to operate and we have to try to understand, both as academics to do research on it and to study, but also in teaching it and in to work with managers who also have to understand this and operate within.
Okay, thank you very much. Leila Hanım, would you like to ask a question? She's a PhD student as well.
Okay.
You have sesinizi açın. You have to turn on your voice.
Hi, thank you very much for the nice presentation. I have two questions. First one is about your ideas about the role of innovation for the companies in the new era. And the second one is about the innovative premiums. As we know, the world's most innovative companies give importance to a specific amount of premiums on their share price. What do you think about this? For example, Tesla Motors does this with an 85% of innovative premiums. What is your ideas about these subjects?
Okay,
please?
all right. The two, I see the two questions as somewhat related. In other words, the importance of innovation is one of the reasons for these premiums, I think. But innovation has been, actually, I've argued from almost the beginning of my career the importance of innovation. Again, I go back to the first article I ever published, which was a long time ago, right out of my PhD program on the creative organization. And the intent of that was to talk about firms that were creative enough to be innovative. Today, I think being entrepreneurial and innovative is absolutely a necessity to stay in existence in any industry, by the way. It's not only in the high technology industries. And I see Tesla, although it's in an automobile industry that may not be considered as high tech, it is a high tech industry in the sense of the application of high technology. Now, the premiums that are offered is because of the use of these technologies. And because they've been, the expectation is not only of the technology they have, but the expectation, I believe, of the continued high technology and changes that they will offer and introduce to the market. And Tesla has And again, I'm not trying to overrate. I've mentioned Tesla before. Tesla has its problems, like most firms, but it has its problems. But it has been more innovative than a number of other automobile companies, certainly in the US, although there are automobile companies from all over the world that can be important and have been. But I think the technology premium that you see is because not only of their existing use of technology, but the expectation of future. Because most of when you talk about the premiums, you talk about the price of the firm or the value of the firm. It's not only of the current assets and the use of them, but it's expectations of future returns that would occur because of that. And they're going to have to continue to be, though, if they falter in any way or at any point in time, there will be other firms that will take on and take over. Will introduce new technologies that will keep them apart. Let me use an example. And this is a U.S. firm. Pardon me for my U.S. examples, but this is a U.S. firm, Intel. For many years, it's changed in most recently, but for many years, it's still innovative, but it was a highly innovative company. And it used a philosophy of introducing new technology on a regular basis, which generally introduced new products along with the new technology, because the industry they're in is a technology-based industry, obviously. But they would continuously change the technology, which would change the product. In other words, they used what was called, pardon the term, but cannibalistic. They would cannibalize their own successful technologies with a new technology. And I'd heard this, I'd read this, but I was exposed to it because for a while I taught an executive MBA course near an Intel operation, and I had several mid-level managers in that executive MBA class. They gave me, I couldn't tell you now, this is 20 years ago, but they gave me examples of the technology that they introduced to the market, to say in January of a year. And before the end of that year, and it was successful, by the way. It generated already within that first year, generated a lot of sales and returns. And the expectation was that technology would have continued to generate higher returns over the next 3 to 5 years. But before the end of that year, they introduced a new technology and product that cannibalized that. It essentially took the market away from the existing product. And we talked about why they did that. They did that to stay ahead of their competition. They did that to ensure that their competitors would not be in there developing a new product and taking that market away. So they stayed ahead of their competition in that way. So all I'm telling you is that future technology is really critical. And I think that premium, well, what I know about, I'm not a finance professor. I've studied a lot of finance work and economics. The value, shareholder value, is based not only on the value of the current assets, but also of the future returns on those assets. And that means continue developing new assets as well as we go. So I don't know. I hope that answers, or at least responds to your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Chidem Hoca, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Professor Hitt. This was really a valuable presentation, and we are honored to have you with us this evening. In fact, I don't have a question, but it is just kind of a comment.
Okay.
Many things that we talk about organizations made me think about individuals. It is like, for instance, being innovative reminds me about self-developing yourself. So this may be related with the fact that the most valuable resource is an organization's people. So it is like, if people develop themselves, then the organization automatically develops itself and becomes better and becomes more successful. So it is kind of an intertwined relationship in there. So I think this is also worth mentioning. Thank you very much.
Well, I do agree with you. In fact, that fits well with my response to an earlier question about the value of human capital and human resources. And in point of fact, we have artificial intelligence. We talked about that, but at artificial intelligence, at least at this stage, does not substitute for human intelligence, although they're trying to move in that direction. We're not there yet, and I don't know when we'll be there, but it's a human capital, the human element plays a critical role. And when we talk about, like in the last several questions that we've had today, last one and others, innovation and introducing new products to the market, it's really based on the human intelligence, the intellect, the ideas, and how that's combined. It's not individual, but oftentimes it's the integration of the group or team intellect that helps
exactly.
you move forward.
And also when we talk about AI, we should also mention the risk, because there are kind of ethical issues, because when, you know, I mean, there may come a point where the AI can control humans, and this may be really risky in terms of ethics and in terms of its consequences. So this is also worth mentioning, I guess.
Actually, it's very worth mentioning, and I do agree that now we move. I don't know when this is going to happen, but we likely will face ethical issues, and if there is a point where the artificial intelligence develops where there's control, at least some control exercise there, those are ethical issues that we'll have to grapple with. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Let me finally tell you that you're a role model for us, being engaged with what you're doing, you know, for a long time. And I really do respect that. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Yeah, well, thank you for your kind comment.
Thank you. Mehmet, would you like to ask a question?
Hello, this is Mehmet. I'm a PhD student, and you mentioned, Professor Hitt, human capital is very important for the companies. And I would like to ask you that, what is the role of entrepreneurs in companies in order to gain sustainable competitive advantage? And also thank you for your sharing. It is very useful presentation for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's critical. I believe that within companies, at first, from a way we manage our human capital, should encourage the employees and those that we work with to bring forth new ideas. Part of the notion of being more creative and innovative, it normally comes, I believe it bubbles up. You can also do things, we create teams that design new products or design new technology, et cetera, and they integrate their intellectual capital. But a lot of other new ideas can come from employees trying to find a better way of doing things that we now do. So you have to create a culture and an environment within the organization that encourages people to bring forth their ideas and to be more entrepreneurial. You know, the notion that I mentioned earlier, strategic entrepreneurship, I was looking at it from an organization standpoint, and that's where a lot of the research has been done that I do. But, you know, the entrepreneurial ideas come from generally individuals or teams of individuals. And so that becomes from the human capital. I mean, that's just the idea. And until we can develop it in some other way, that's going to be the human capital where the ideas come. But the firms have to encourage that. And I know that I've been in companies where, in organizations where employees feel encouraged to submit new ideas or develop ideas that bring forth, be more entrepreneurial. And also in organizations where that's not encouraged. And over time, the ones where they're more entrepreneurial are the ones that I believe will be more successful. So the entrepreneurial notion should go down to the individual employee and be encouraged culturally. And I'm thinking about the environment's culture. I'm not talking about the culture of society, although that's important, but the culture within the organization.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Doğan, would you like to ask a question?
Yes. First, good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to you.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to say that I'm proud to be here with you and to listen to you. Thank you so much for your valuable presentation. I have two questions with your permission. First question, what is the importance of meta and dynamic capabilities for adaptation and shaping strategies? Could you give an example? And second question, wars, epidemics, energy and resource and political problems. We certainly live in a very difficult world. What kind of leadership is needed, or what kind of leadership it brings to the world, especially for the company? Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, both
He's our
of
PhD student as well.
Okay. Well, thank you. And what I would say, both those are actually difficult questions, but they're very good questions. The first one, what I would say to you is that the capabilities are critical. When we talk about adjusting strategies and shaping strategies, both involve change. There are different degrees and different types of change, but they involve change. Adjusting, you by definition, if you look at the term of adjust, you're making some change to adjust to the environment. It may be to adjust to new competitors that enter the market, or adjust to changes in the economic environment, or adjust to changes in the supply chain, et cetera. You're adjusting your current operations. To do so, you have to change. So that means you have to change. You may need new capabilities, or you need to change existing capabilities. And in doing that, you have to have dynamic capabilities. Truly be able to change. Now, again, when I look at this, one of my criticisms of David Teese is, and others that do work in this area of dynamic capabilities, is they talk about it. They've added like sensing, seizing, and shaping, etc. But in point of fact, there's been very, very little empirical research that really understand what, say, dynamic capabilities are exactly. Normally what it is how we manage the changes, and they manage the changes in the capabilities. So dynamic capabilities are important, honestly, to do that. The notion of dynamic capabilities is changing, either developing new capabilities or changing existing capabilities to allow you to adapt to that environment. And so you do need dynamic capabilities to do that. Some firms are better at it than others. Meta capabilities is, again, it's a third order change or third order type of capability in which it's the ability to develop dynamic capabilities. And when I say that, you say, well, okay, why do we have to do that? You're just stair stepping. Many companies are large and complex. Let's take a multinational company that operates in multiple countries, say 20 different countries. No matter where it's headquartered, it has subsidiaries in 19 other countries. And each subsidiary may be different. So you may have to adapt to 19 or 20 different markets, or maybe more markets that you just serve, but you don't have located. You don't have locations in terms of subsidiaries in those markets. You have to have managerial dynamic capabilities. This is a term that Connie Helfat, some of her colleagues, developed. Managerial dynamic capabilities. It's the managers being able to make these changes in the capabilities in those operations. Now, meta capabilities would be the ability to develop dynamic capabilities. And I would say in a multinational firm, normally the meta capability will come from the home office that develops managers that can develop dynamic capabilities wherever they operate and exist. Now, I gave an example earlier of the application of dynamic capabilities, and it's using acquisitions. It's not the only way you would change your, or you can change your capabilities, and maybe not even the most common way. But I believe it is one way for firms to add new capabilities and or to gain capabilities that they integrate with their current capabilities to enrich them. And in the study we did, we found like Symantec made 3 different acquisitions, and each one of the companies it acquired and integrated into its firm had different but complementary capabilities. And it allowed them for that firm, for Symantec, to move from being a software, antivirus software development and marketer to a corporate security company and engage a much broader set of capabilities, all of which were important, but they integrated. So they did it by making acquisitions. Now that's an example of the application, at least, of dynamic capabilities. I don't know, I hope that helps you a little bit on that. Now, the second one, you're talking about leadership. Now, this is actually an area I've also done some writing in on kind of the strategic leadership that's needed in these firms. We did an article, very simple, I call it a simple article, we published in Business Horizons, and I think about 2010, 2011. And we talked about strategic leadership in the 21st century. And actually what we did is we took a couple of papers that were done about the end of the 20th century, about 2000, just before, and where they talked about strategic leadership and said, what's needed? And what we did is we analyzed, well, in the first 10 years of the new 21st century, how did we do? Well, actually, we didn't do very good. And I'm thinking we collectively of businesses worldwide. This is not just in the US. But essentially, we developed an idea of what leaders have to do. One, something we talked about today is they have to be innovative, entrepreneurial. They have to engage. And they're not just themselves have to be entrepreneurial, but just like the previous question, the people that work for them, they have to engage their entrepreneurial capability and become more innovative. They also, another issue that actually we mentioned earlier, talking about artificial intelligence, is the ethical notions. And obviously ethics is a question that's fraught with difficulty and going across different cultures and what it means. But essentially there is a global ethic in terms of treating and how we work with other human beings. And all I can say is that the most effective leaders are those that practice ethical leadership. I don't care, not just to the people within, but all their dealings with stakeholders. You mentioned how important stakeholders have become and will become over the next several years, as Jay and Barney and some of his colleagues have noted. And in dealing with stakeholders, you have to deal with them in a fashion that they feel they're treated well and in a way that they feel partners, if you will, to what you do and so on. So we listed a number of things but the 2 things I just mentioned are really critical elements. The third one that I'll mention is they have to be looking to the future, always looking to the future. You have to be concerned about the present, but you cannot be so focused on the present that you don't see the future, because there's always change coming. And you have to have a vision of where you want to go. And frankly, that vision probably changes over time because of other changes you can't control. And you have to continuously change that to be a part of, effectively operate within these competitive environments and within all of the other socio-political and technological and institutional changes that firms must operate within different countries, across regions, and within their industries. It's again, a highly complex element. But there are people that are good at that, but we have too few right now. We need more. And that's no matter where we are, no matter what country, whatever, we need better strategic leaders.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Emily, would you like to ask a question?
Good evening, Prof. I am a
our PhD student as well.
Okay, very good.
Firstly, thank you for presentation. I have a question. Could you give an example by comparing adaptive and shaping strategies according to resource usage differences?
Well, shaping strategies are by definition where you identify an opportunity in an uncertain environment, something that's very, very new. And so what you would have to do is look back. You know, I could look back. I'm going to look back a ways to do that. So it's probably one we could all understand. But so I'm going to be looking back rather than the future, because I can't always identify what will be successful in the future. But I can look back over time, and I'll give two examples. They may be time worn somewhat, but I consider them very good examples. One of those I mentioned briefly earlier was Amazon.com. Jeff Bezos. Now, I'm not going to tell you everything that Amazon's done is perfect or appropriate. I'm only looking back to where he saw an uncertain time, a new technology, and an opportunity that others did not see. That's by definition being an entrepreneur. And he saw the use of, at that time, 1995, when the internet was introduced by 1994. Amazon came online in 1995, and it was actually introduced and developed much earlier than that, but starting in 1994 is where we started seeing a much more expanded use of the internet and doing things like what we're doing now, right now, virtual meetings. But what they had in 1995, he introduced the notion early of selling books on the internet. And at the time, this say in the US, the largest book retailer was Barnes and Noble. And it was highly successful. Barnes and Noble were developing huge bookstores with inventories of books, and they were driving out a lot of regional and local booksellers in the US. And they were all retailers that had a brick and mortar operations, did it, but they did it because they developed these big and had other attractions. They'd have Starbucks or other coffee environment where people could come in and relax and look at the books and other products that they sold and enjoy their time there. So Barnes & Noble was highly successful. So when Amazon came on, they first had none of that. They sold their books by electronically. And someone asked Barnes & Noble, are you worried about this new firm that's come into your environment? He said, nah, we're the biggest, we're the best. That's just, they're not going to, people are going to come see us. And they didn't do anything. Well, by the end of the first year, Amazon had actually a pretty strong sales operation because they did attract people that couldn't take the time to come into the brick and mortar stores. It was easier access, more efficient. And by the way, in Barnes and Noble, even though they had huge stores, they had large inventories, but they couldn't have an inventory of any book and all books. Whereas Amazon on the internet, they had access to inventory of almost all books, many books anyway. So they could sell a lot larger inventory and get them to them pretty quickly. So Barnes and Noble tried to develop this new, then they said, well, we got to do something. So they started trying to develop a competitive product, but they were way behind and never developed a product that would compete with Amazon. By that time, Amazon had moved into other markets, music first, and then, you know, they now compete in every market you can consider. Now, I'm not trying to be a proponent of Amazon, but what I do think at that time, that's an example of a shaping strategy that saw this opportunity with new technology and the uncertainty in the environment, and to serve a market, define a market, and to beat competition. Another example, and this again is a US example, and I apologize for that, but it was Apple. That in effect, now partly because of a very innovative entrepreneurial leader, he had many other problems, but he had really good insight and saw the future. And essentially during the first, I don't know, late 1990s and the early first 10 years in 2000, Apple disrupted at least 4 major industries and changed them dramatically. You know, I'm sitting right here with a mobile phone, and I do everything on that mobile phone. You do too, I assume. But going back in the 1990s, I didn't have a mobile phone. There were mobile phones, but they were very large, cumbersome, and difficult to deal with. And then we had the mobile phone, and that's just one example. But that mobile phone also disrupted photography. At one time, there was a company named Polaroid, which was the world leader in instant, what they defined as instant photography. So you could take a photograph, and within a very short period of time, that photograph developed within a few 10 seconds or so, and you could see the photograph. I can take it digitally now. Digital photography came into the fore because of this technology and essentially took the market away from Polaroid. Polaroid went from being one of the top 100 companies in the world in size and sales to being bankrupt within 3 years because of digital technology changes. So what I'm telling you is that it's the shaping strategies, and these are all shaping strategies. That doesn't mean they don't have something happen to them by future. Even Bezos said within 10 years, Amazon may have a lot of problems because somebody's going to develop something different and unique that will take our markets away. And I think there's that potential. So I do think if you look at industries, if you look at products, and if you look at even the global economy, there are going to be a lot of changes. The technology is often a driver, but there may be opportunities that are created because of economic conditions or other factors that allow firms to enter the market with uncertain and develop what we call a shaping strategy, normally because of innovation or being entrepreneurial, and are able to capture a market. I don't know. I hope that helps. These are old companies and examples, but they are examples of a shaping strategy.
Thank you. Oais, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Professor. First of all, to conduct this wonderful webinar. I am also PhD student and doing my PhD under the supervision of Professor Tuba. Sir, I have one question, Professor, that do you think that undergraduate and graduate education in the field of management will change in near future?
That's actually a good question. The answer is it should. We need to adapt and integrate all this information that I'm talking about, that we're talking about, and others in that process. And again, because I know it most of all in the US, although I have taught in programs in Asia and in Europe. So I have taught in other programs, normally as a guest lecturer, or in some cases, I've taught courses in particular programs, often graduate programs, in both outside the US. But what I would say to you is that it should. Now, what I find, and I'm going to be very honest, that I find just like in all kinds of businesses, academic organizations don't always easily change. And our curriculum doesn't change as quickly sometimes as it should. And the content of courses don't, partly because it's tied to what we know and what we want to do. But the answer is it should, because we are developing knowledge at a considerable pace. I look at the number of journals, the number of books that are written. Several of you have talked about books and or articles either that you've written or that others. And I look at the pace of that change, even in our field. I'm going to talk about the academy management. When I came into this field, there was one journal in the published by the academy management. Now this was, I'm telling my age, unfortunately, but I entered the academic world in 1974. At that time, the only journal published by the Academy of Management was the Academy of Management Journal. Since that time, they've introduced multiple other journals, such as the Academy Management Review, Academy of Management Learning, and etc., the Academy of AMP, Academy Management Perspectives, which used to be Academy Management Executive, and Academy Management Discoveries, D, and they've added one or two others most recently. In the field of strategy, which most of us, you've mentioned in many of the concepts and topics we've discussed today, somehow revolve around strategic management. In 1974 was called business policy. I was taught primarily by economists in my area of business policy, and organization theorists, which comes from sociology. At that time, I spent a lot of time reading sociological work as well as economics. The Strategic Management Journal was introduced in 1980, and which is now a very prominent journal in our field. And since that time, in the Strategic Management Society introduced Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal and the Global Strategy Journal. So they have three journals. The Academy of International Business. I could go on, and there are many other journals that have added to this field and publishing large amounts of really high quality research and distributing knowledge. The Financial Times 50 list of, and really it's now, I think it's 55 or more journals that they list, what they consider the top journals in the field of business. And many of our journals are on this list. Now, why do I bring this up? Because that means all these journals are publishing high quality research and knowledge, and we have to stay up to date in these areas. I've been an editor of two different journals, Academy Management Journal at one time, and then I helped initiate the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. And I've done a number of special issues of journals. What I found is it's very difficult to do all the reading and stay up to date in the fields of my interests, but you have to if you're going to teach in your specialty area. You teach strategic management. Even today, I teach it much differently than I taught early in my career, and it's because of all the new knowledge. So what I would tell you, it should be, should have changing capabilities of teaching in our field like we do in businesses. And that's based on the new knowledge that's developed. And it's very difficult to stay up to date in all these changes in our knowledge, and yet we have to. Those of you who are PhD students, it's exciting, but also a little daunting of all this new knowledge that you have to continuously update. And so when you finish your PhD, it doesn't stop, it starts. All your learning continues. I don't say it starts, it continues, and you never quit. Last thing I would say is one of the very positive things about our profession and all of you is that you have the opportunity to keep doing that. You may get older physically, but intellectually, you stay young because of all the stuff you learn, you read, and you adapt. And that's one of the wonderful things about our profession. So that goes beyond what you asked, but I do think that it should be different, but it should be attuned to the new field and new knowledge, and we should adapt our courses and content with the field as we develop this new knowledge. Hopefully, textbooks and other things that we use stay up to date and do that.
Thanks a lot, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So what might be the preferred strategies to reduce resource dependency in the new era?
And you're talking about resource dependency, where we are dependent on certain resources. Of course, there's a resource dependence theory that exists, and one of my former students, Amy Hillman, played a big role, and she didn't start it, she's just continued it. But resource dependency, most firms are dependent on resources from specific or key stakeholders. And whatever you say, nearly all organizations have some resource dependence. And that includes even the large, what we consider very resourceful, have a lot of slack resources, but there are areas where they're dependent. The young firms we've already talked about, the new firms who have very limited resources, so they've got to find a way to focus them. The resource dependents, what they have to do, hopefully, is to make changes and adapt so they're less dependent on specific resources as they change. And frankly, the pandemic at least has awakened many firms to these resource dependencies. It may be because of the supply chains and how they need to develop for either access to certain resources or develop products that need fewer of those resources that are so scarce. Some firms have been able to do that much effectively and others have not. But that's going to be a critical element in managing your resource portfolio is very critical, and knowing areas where there is potential dependence, either on a particular resource or particular suppliers for those special resources. Now, I don't know if that really answers your question, but it is an element that every organization has certain dependencies. And I would also say that we've talked about human resources. Human resources tend to be some of the more mobile resources, as they can move from organization to organization. And there could be some of those critical human resources that are some of those human resources that are very critical for firms. I was listening to or learning about it, reading about a study recently, talking about some of the research scientists that move from one organization to another. Now, normally they have contracts that don't allow them to provide certain kinds of special knowledge that they used in development products, but their intellect can be used to develop new ones. And if they are mobile and you lose them, you may have may be critical for the firm's performance. I'm going to use another example. I don't know if this is relevant to any of you. I'm interested in sports. And if you're interested, well, what we call football in the US is different from what you call football, or we use the term soccer. But typically there are key individuals on these teams that have capabilities that if they move from one team to another can change. They subtract, or that their capability is lost to one team, it's added to another and can do it. So I'm just telling you how human capital, for me, when I look at any kind of sporting endeavor, it's based on oftentimes human capital. And if they move from one team to another, they are dependent on those resources. So it can change the whole dynamics and the ability that team or that organization to be successful. And that's true of employees in any field. So I use that as an example because I'm interested in it, but it also, to me, shows the criticality of human capital and the importance of specific resources to the success of a particular firm.
Okay, thank you very much. And
Yes.
last question is, what might be your suggestions for further research in the field of management? Which areas should we focus?
Well, actually, there are lots of opportunities for future research. I believe I'm doing research in a variety of different areas personally, and I always have. Mergers and acquisitions, I've done studies over the years, and I mentioned one most recently. Although that's not been the major thrust of my research, it's one that I've had a strong interest in from day one. I would say to you that we need to better understand the adjusting and shaping strategies that I mentioned by Violina Grindova and her colleague, and that have been enhanced by Kathy Eisenhart, particularly the shaping strategies. Now, understand exactly what they mean. I mean, I can understand them and I know we need more research on them, empirical research. We dearly need more empirical research on dynamic capabilities. Most of the work has been of a conceptual or theoretical nature. I did mention a study that I'd done with David Brock, where we studied these organizations, international organizations that had used capabilities, and we defined based on what they did, whether they were dynamic capabilities or other forms of capabilities. But what we found is very few really captured dynamic capabilities. I mean, if I look at it, they're more on other types of capabilities. I do think more research on the capabilities, the changes in capabilities on the resource portfolio and how you manage that inside the firm. And of course, this is my own research with David Sermon and others. But I do think that that's extremely critical, and how that interacts with international. International strategy is has been a key area of interest of mine for a long time, since, probably more than 30 years. And I've done a lot of research in that. Over time, my own thinking has developed. And I think I think I know more than I did then, and I also know how much I don't know yet, because it also keeps changing. The field keeps changing because of socio-political changes and all the other things that occur in our environment. There are lots of opportunities. Some of the review papers that I've been involved in recent times, one is on international strategy, and I published it in the strategy journal, World Business, but it had a strategic focus. And that had a number of potential research questions that could be addressed, need to be addressed. And several of the special issues that we've done recently on international entrepreneurship in the Global Strategy Journal, on strategic leadership that we published in the Leadership Quarterly just not a few months ago, have a lot of several research questions that need to be addressed if you're interested in that area. So one of the things I would do if I were encouraged to do this, depending on my own interest, I would find one, special issues that have been done that focus in these areas. And normally within those special issues, either the articles that are included or in particular, the introductory article will list a number of research questions that need to be addressed and would maybe provide ideas for you and your research. I know that given the special issues in which I've been involved and still involved in last one right now, but we tend to offer either there or in our review papers. Just one other area that just a recent review paper that there are two different review papers that one just published this last year in Journal Management, and one that has literally just been posted online. The one that was in last year was on using experimental research in strategy. So it's looking more at methods, but how they're applied and how they're used. And we talk about different ways of doing that. And then most recently, with Jean-Luc Argel, some French colleagues, and I and Don Berg have a paper on organizational autonomy. It's been literally just put online a few days ago with Journal Management, and it's a review paper. So I would look at some of these review papers, both in Academy of Management Annals and Journal Management in particular, because they have good ideas for research questions. So what I'm trying to tell you is there's so many opportunities and really needs for good research. For me I could mention some, but I would encourage you to take your interest that you have, look at those particular, find either the special issues or review papers that focus in some of those areas, and you'll get, I think, a rich set of potential research questions that you can choose from to try to address that haven't been addressed but need to be addressed. So that would be my encouragement.
Okay, thank you very much, dear Professor. It's my honor that you are our host today. You are our guest today, and I hope we can conduct a joint research later on. And we would like to see you in Istanbul whenever you want, whenever you are available. So we would like to see you in our university. And Elçin Hoca would like to say, I'm sure, the closing speech.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to be here with you. hope you did gain some value from something that I said either in the talk or in our, I think the question and answer period was a lot richer, and I hope that you gained value from that. And it's my pleasure to meet all of you, and I wish you the very best. Okay?
Thank you very much for
Thank
your
you very much.
contributions.
Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Sir Pat. Thank you.
We would like to see you in our university whenever you
Okay.
want.
Yeah, good
Thank
night to
very
you.
much.
I still
Good
got
night. Thanks so much for
Bye-bye.
everyone.